everyone, it's Michaela. Welcome back to my channel. And today we have a special guest on my channel. This is something I've never done before. So this is Molly. She is a commercial fisherman up here in Alaska. So Molly, if you want to introduce yourself and just tell people how you got to where you are, what you do exactly, and just introduce yourself.
Yeah, so my name is Molly. I was raised in a remote commercial fishing community here in Alaska. I've been fishing since I was about 4 years old. My family owned a commercial fishing boat, and so I grew up on the water fishing with them. And I've participated in several fisheries in Alaska, but most recently I've been longlining for Pacific halibut and blackcod in the summer in between college semesters. And I'm also a third-year fisheries student here at UAS.
Awesome. So you mentioned you grew up in a small fishing town. So were your parents always fishermen, or did they kind of start when you started at 4 years old?
So my parents weren't always commercial fishermen. My mom is originally from Arizona, and she came to Alaska to work in a cannery when she was like 21 years old and fell in love with Alaska and decided that's where she was going to stay.
Mhm.
And my dad grew up in Southern California in San Diego, and he originally worked on big sport fishing boats, going after tuna and swordfish and things like that. And then he transitioned into commercial fishing kind of in his 20s. He went squid fishing and some other commercial fisheries down there. And then he came up to Alaska to run a charter boat sport fishing in the town that I was raised in. And he also fell in love with Alaska, met my mom, and then they had me and they decided to stay here. And then when I was 4, they bought their first commercial fishing boat.
Oh, what a cute love story. That's
Yeah.
awesome. Okay, so now that we kind of did your introduction and oh, I got a reminder. I hope you can't hear that on the recording. But okay, now that we got those introductions out of the way, do you want to talk about what commercial fishing is? How is it special up in Alaska compared to anywhere else? Because when people think of Alaska, I think a lot of people think, oh, great salmon fishing and just great fishing in general.
Yeah. So, kind of to start off, I think the word commercial fishing is really misunderstood a lot of times by many people, and it's kind of not accurately portrayed in the media.
Mhm.
So commercial fishing simply means catching fish for commercial profit. It includes both large-scale factory-owned vessels by major corporations, as well as small-scale family-owned operations, like the ones that my family and many of my friends' families own and operate today.
Mhm.
Um, and I think a good example is like, in documentaries that kind of push this narrative that commercial fishing is bad and we're destroying the oceans, they oftentimes don't include even fisheries that are small scale where people are still fishing out of nets, pulling in their or fishing out of skiffs, pulling in their nets by hand. We have those still in Alaska.
Mhm.
Um, and Alaska is really unique. We actually are the only state with sustainability written into our state's constitution.
I
Um,
didn't even know that.
yeah, it's a really important aspect to our life here in Alaska and the management of our resources. A lot of people don't realize that Alaska actually became a state in order to protect our natural resources. So
Mhm.
Alaska became the 49th state in 1959. And at that time, there was a lot of influence by outside owned companies, particularly canneries, that had a lot of power and control over commercial fishing in Alaska, particularly for salmon. And
Mhm.
so we became a state in order to protect our natural resource rights and make sure that they would be sustainable for years to come.
Okay, that's a little bit of history that I did not know.
Yeah.
So you mentioned that commercial fishing is falsely portrayed in documentaries, and I know we started this idea based off of seaspiracy, and it just opened up a whole different can of worms. So with seaspiracy, can you tell me your thoughts from a fisherman's standpoint and a fisherman's point of view? Was there anything you thought was completely misinterpreted or what's the word, misrepresented? Was there anything you thought that you were like, okay, they did like an okay job of explaining that? And what are just your all honest thoughts on this film?
Yeah. So Originally, when Seaspiracy came out last month, many people in Alaska, in commercial fishing in Alaska, were really upset, and this includes myself, because we felt like part of the narrative was really left out. It felt like it was very convenient that Alaskan fisheries and United States fisheries were excluded and not even mentioned in the documentary. Um,
Yeah, Alaska and the United States were, I don't even think, mentioned for more than maybe a minute. They maybe
yeah,
like, oh, United States, okay, now we're gonna move back to Japan and overseas.
yeah, and I think when they were mentioned, it was only the negative things that have happened, and that's, that's true. Bad things have happened in fisheries in the United States. It's not like we're perfect,
Mhm.
but especially here in Alaska, we work really, really hard to make sure that our fisheries are sustainable, and that's not just the species that we're targeting. That's non-target bycatch species too. Stock assessments and sustainable resource management is a huge part of our state. And so it felt like the narrative was very one-sided. I will say I really do think that raising awareness about international fishing is very important. I think a lot of people don't really understand how laws and regulation work out on the ocean. Um, I do think that they missed big parts of how law works out on the ocean, but I do think that they really did a good job of kind of saying, look, out on the open ocean, there's limited regulation, there's little enforcement, and there are fish stocks that are being hit really hard and it's not sustainable.
Yeah, I think they mentioned, you can correct me if I'm wrong with this, but they mentioned halibut is um, overseas a really big problem, as well as tuna. I had an idea of the tuna industry just because of how
Mhm.
popular and how cheap tuna is in grocery stores. I think it's like you can buy that Star Kiss tuna for like $1 a can. Like looking at that, you're like, that is definitely not sustainable because they are catching enough to market it so low. But okay, well, thanks for your opinion on that. I know we talked a lot about so many other things about seaspiracy, but can you talk about, because they talked about trawling and gill nets and all the different ways that fish are caught in the film. But they didn't really say like, oh, this is good for if you want to catch this or you want to use this method. Could you kind of explain the difference? Because to someone, I grew up fishing with just like a little pole and like a little lake. So on a big scale, can you talk about the different methods that are used and how each, because I know each has their bad things, but I know each is also contributing to sustainable fishing for the future as well.
Yeah. So there's lots of different methods used by commercial fishermen worldwide. There's gill nets, there's seine nets, there's trawl nets, there's troll gear, which is different than trawling. There's long lines, there's pots, there's many, many different methods, and it depends on what you're fishing for. But even within those types of fishing, there's differences. So there's differences between bottom long lines and pelagic long lines. And so I think when we're looking at issues with fisheries and kind of what gear is good, what gear is destructive, it really depends on where you're fishing and what you're targeting. And I
Mhm.
think a good example of this is a really kind of commonly criticized fishery are pelagic longlines that target things like swordfish and tuna,
Mhm.
kind of big species that are out in the open ocean. That's very different than the longlining I do.
Mhm.
um, you know, a big problem is they have high rates of bycatch, and part of that is the hooks are floating at the surface. Whereas the fishing I do with long lines is on the bottom. So we're not catching seabirds, we're not catching turtles, we're not catching things that are going to be at, well, there's no turtles in Alaska too, that helps.
Yeah, that helps.
But, we're not, it's completely different.
Mhm.
And so I think a lot of times you can kind of make a blanket statement, but it's not necessarily true for all the fisheries, even within one gear type. I will say that they focused very heavily on trawling, which is very common in media focused on commercial fishing. And I personally don't know of many trawl fisheries that are considered sustainable. Um, Even in Alaska, our trawl fisheries, while they're considered sustainable, there's a lot of criticism, and they're under a lot of pressure right now. And actually, most of it's coming from other fishermen because of issues with bycatch of species that are targeted by other fisheries, like the one I participate in.
Okay, and we even just saw a couple days ago that killer whale picture that was circulating. Wasn't that also from a trawl, or was that something else?
That was from a trawler.
Okay, so the film did a good job of explaining this is a problem, but they didn't really say what you could do to help. That was
Yeah.
another problem that we talked about with this film, because they have a lot of problems but don't seem to have a lot of solutions.
Yeah.
Well, they have one solution, and that's just to not eat fish at all, which, living up in Alaska for the last couple months, I already found out that's not easy for people to do,
Yeah.
especially from small fishing towns like you and other, even in other states that have small fishing towns. But so what's the most common method of fishing up here in Alaska, or where you fish over the summers?
So it depends on the species that's being targeted. So for salmon, the most common is gill nets,
Mhm.
seine nets, troll gear, which is where you essentially drag hooks behind your boat. You tow them at slow speeds, using long poles sticking out from the boat. And they're not like fishing poles, like a rod and reel. They're big, big metal poles that stick out really far away from the boat. Um, For halibut, they're primarily caught. In fact, I think they're only caught by longline here in Alaska. Um, Sablefish or black cod, which is another species I target, is caught from pots or by longline.
Okay.
Um, and then there's more specific species that are also targeted. Any shellfish is generally caught, so that's like crab, is
Mhm.
caught through pots. Um, There's like Pacific cod, which will be caught by a long line or in pot gear. So it really depends on the fishery you're in and the species you're targeting. And there's not one type of fishery for each species generally.
Okay. So, growing up in Southern California, I've gone lobster fishing. Our lobster season, I believe, is September through March or September through May, one of the two. And we use those little like metal, I think you call them pods. Excuse me, I'm not a fisheries expert, but down in California is a really big problem with pollution just from regular old fishing people that are just throw their lines. That doesn't seem to be a problem up in Alaska. And is that because the people up here just have like a better understanding, or is there something written in the laws of Alaska like preventing things like that since it's such a big fishing area?
I think one thing that helps in terms of commercial fishing, a lot of commercial fisheries are limited into the amount of gear you can have.
Mhm.
So, for instance, the sablefish or black cod is what they're also commonly referred to as fishery using pots. You're limited to a certain number of pots in each area. So, you can't just have as many pots as you want. And so
Okay.
that reduces the likelihood of you losing gear because you don't care. You can get rid of that gear and replace it right away. It's not like
Mhm.
that here in Alaska. um, I also think that a big reason is we don't want to lose our gear. Gear is really, really expensive to replace. It costs thousands of dollars.
Mhm.
And whether that's nets or line, hooks, whatever you're using, it's expensive.
So, with being in the fishing community, I'm sure you have heard so much said about you, and you're like, that's not true. That's not true. What are you on? Like, that's not even true at all. So, can you talk about the common, I guess, misconceptions, misunderstandings, rumors, or just anything that is commonly heard of when someone mentions fisheries and they're like, oh, yeah, blah, blah, blah. And um, Yeah, just address like the common misunderstandings, misinterpretations of the fishing industry and community.
Yeah, so I think the biggest misconception is that fishermen don't care about the resource we're harvesting. I can't speak for, fishermen in other parts of the world. I can't speak for even fishermen across the United States. However, in my experience, any fisherman I've met in the United States or in Alaska, we really care about the resource we're harvesting. I just like any other job, it's how we pay our bills, it's how we feed our families, we build our lives off of it. And so we don't want to see our resource disappear. Healthy stocks means job security for us. And I remember one time reading, maybe it was related to an article about seaspiracy, but reading an article where someone was talking to a commercial fisherman and they were like, if you weren't harvesting the resource, would you still care? It's like, yeah, of course we would. Why do we have any less of a reason to like care
Yeah.
about the ocean than the average person? In fact, I think we care more.
I
You
was
know,
going to say, why don't you go ask the average person, like that's
yeah,
sitting on the beach and littering our beach, how much you care about the ocean? That's like asking someone who is a forest ranger, oh, do you really care about the forest?
yeah,
Like, why don't you go ask the hikers that are having a picnic and leaving their trash?
exactly. And it's especially in rural communities or fishing communities in Alaska, it's our lifeblood. It's how we make our livelihood, like I've said. And so it really bothers me when I'm portrayed as this person who's like greedy and I'm off to just destroy the environment and I don't care and I kill everything, because that's not true.
Yeah.
Um, I think another big misconception is just kind of related to commercial fishing in general. Like if you compare, a fishery in the middle of the Atlantic or Pacific Ocean that's in international waters compared to a fishery in Alaska. And I know it probably seems a little fishy, that this whole video I've been going like, oh, well, it depends on the fishery. And it might seem like I'm avoiding the question. But really, what that means is that each fishery is really unique here in Alaska, and we manage it based on its own characteristics. So there's no way you can make a blanket statement for, a fishery targeting halibut or a fishery targeting salmon. We're all unique,
Hmm.
and we manage accordingly.
Yeah, I was gonna say because the maintenance you do on a truck is not the same you do on a car. So what
Yeah.
you are doing to maintain halibut fishing isn't going to be the same as salmon or gill nets and long lining. Like it's, I think people like to put fishing as one big umbrella, but here's fishing umbrella, and then you have halibut fishing umbrella, and then you have like gill net fishing umbrella, and then there's so many different branches on that tree.
Yeah.
And I think I agree with you. When people hear fishing, they're like, oh, they're just out like polluting our oceans and killing the fish and everything like that. I know you said there's a gear limitation that you can't have, like, you can have this amount of gear and you can't go past that. Do you guys also have that with fish? Like, do you have a limit? Like, okay, we reached our limit, we're done for the day or done for the season, or how does that work?
Yeah. So again, it depends on the fishery, which I know that's like what I keep saying over and over. And that doesn't mean that like I'm avoiding a question. It's just it's a really complex topic. So I guess I'll speak in terms of halibut because that's what I know best. And I kind of wanted to address something brought up in Seaspiracy. They talked about how halibut stocks have been in decline. I can't remember what year that they referenced.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and I was kind of upset because they didn't make the distinction. Is that Atlantic halibut? Is that Pacific halibut? What halibut species are you talking about? Because halibut isn't a species.
Mm-hmm.
There's many different species of halibut. In the Pacific Northwest, we've got California halibut, which are, kind of more off the continental US. And then we've got Pacific halibut. So that was kind of a gray area for me that I immediately picked up on.
Yeah.
But in terms of how we manage halibut, so halibut in Alaska and the United States are actually managed through a joint international council between Alaska, well, the United States and Canada. And this is because halibut don't stay in one place throughout their life. So a halibut might end up in British Columbia and then swim up to Alaska.
Hmm.
And so we kind of need to include both countries to make fair management decisions. So if you looked at a map, we call it an IFQ, it's an individual fishing quota of Alaska. Alaska's split up into different regions, and stock assessments will be done in each different region to kind of assess what's the biomass looking like, how much can we harvest.
Hmm.
And then from there, they limit how many pounds each vessel can capture. It's called a vessel cap. So you can't go over your vessel cap, but you also, on top of that, have to be permitted with the IFQs to fish those pounds. So it's not like I have a boat, I go to an area, let's say 3A, and I just start fishing and I'm limited to X amount of pounds just because I want to go halibut fishing. I have to be permitted with IFQ pounds to go catch those pounds. And then I'm also limited in how many IFQs I can have on my boat.
And that is to prevent, like, if me and someone wanted to go on my friend's boat and catch all these halibut and just bring it back and do whatever we wanted for it, that's put in place to protect the species, because I would assume if anyone could just go out and catch that limit, that there would be a decrease in numbers.
And I also think that part of what was missed was there's been a big switch in the fishery style for Pacific halibut. So I don't know if they were talking about Pacific halibut, but I was immediately like, I can speak on this issue.
Mm-hmm.
So in the 90s and before that for a while, we had what was called a derby style fishery. So what they would do, management would open a certain area for like 1 day at a time. And any boat, anyone could go fish as much as they wanted,
Mm-hmm.
which was really unstable, but also it was really dangerous for the fishermen because if you have 1 day to make your livelihood and to catch all the fish you're going to be allowed to catch in that area in a year, you're going to, make your crew work really hard and they're going to want to work hard. They're going to push really hard to make money.
Was that even physically possible? Because I've gone fishing a couple times and I'm sitting there for hours and nothing is biting. So
Yeah.
it was either like, okay, we get screwed over and there's nothing, and now we have nothing for the whole year, or we're like, cool, we got this many fish and the next boat is going to get this many fish. So I guess there's no more to catch.
Yeah. So it's different like with what you're doing sport fishing versus commercial fishing. What they would do commercial fishing is they just turn gear, which means you set your gear and you haul your gear
Mm-hmm.
over and over and over until you basically just end up with fish or you wind up with nothing at all. And a big problem that was also happening was people were going out in weather in boats that they shouldn't have been going out in. So the rate of accident and death was super high for fishermen in that fishery. And so managers stepped back and like, wait a minute, the biomass isn't doing well because of this fishery and it's really dangerous. How can we reform it? And that's where the IFQ industry came in.
Oh, that's very interesting. I wasn't aware of the IFQ and how that was broken down. But so Seaspiracy talked about there's no such thing as sustainable fishing. I guess not in really Seaspiracy. Sea Shepherd said that, and then they put it in the film. And I used to think Sea Shepherd was great. Like, I loved watching Whale Wars as a kid, and I watched all their YouTube videos and stuff. But now it just seems like they're just very problematic and counterproductive, because so with I'll use this example. In California, we have mountain lions and we have deer. And if we removed all the mountain lions, the deers would be exploding. So if we never fished again in our lives, that would throw off the whole ecosystem of the whole ocean. The fish might not cause a huge problem, but then something below them might have a huge problem, or something above them might have a huge problem. So I think with what Sea Shepherd was saying about no sustainable fishing, just the fact that the IFQ has set this in place is kind of a way of making fishing sustainable.
Yeah, and I think that, kind of bringing up Sea Shepherd, I feel like, a lot of people think that they've done a lot of good. I personally think the organization is really problematic.
And right.
Not just for the fact that I'm a fisherman and, I practice sustainable fishing, and they obviously have a very skewed understanding of what sustainable fishing is. And I can't speak on this issue because I'm not Alaska Native, but one thing that really does frustrate me is that, Alaska Native tribes are allowed to harvest marine mammals, and Sea Shepherd has done some horrible things
Yes.
In terms of, addressing that topic. Paul Watson has called out and attacked teenagers who have been, harvesting sustainably marine mammals in their communities. And there's been a lot of issues. So that's a whole other topic, and it's not one that I really can address completely because I'm not Alaska Native, but I felt like I had to throw that in there.
Yeah, I agree with you. People see Sea Shepherd and what they're putting out because they're only putting out what they want you to see. And to someone who isn't educated about the ocean as much as we are, they're like, "Oh my God, our oceans are being overfished and blah 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 blah. We need to just stop eating fish." And there was another documentary. This is another reason why I don't like them. There was another documentary called Sea of Shadows, and it was focusing on the vaquita and the totoaba down in the Gulf of Mexico. And Sea Shepherd decided that it would be okay for them to go down to the Gulf of Mexico and basically try to stop the total fishing of the totoaba. And while I think that there needs to be some reform there, or else the totoaba and the vaquita are going to be extinct, and that's going to throw off the whole Sea of Cortez and Gulf of Mexico. But they seem to have a lot. They seem to have a very high ego and a lot of privilege that they think that they can go down there and be like, "This is what we're going to do, and now you need to stop it." And I'm not sure how active you are on Twitter or in the Twitter marine biology community, but there was this is a little off topic, but it ties back to marine mammals and what we were talking about earlier. There was this Twitter account that was an NGO, as they claimed, and they were talking about commercial sealing in Canada. And they quoted the tweet and they said, "Well, we can't forget that Indigenous people are still killing seals too." And I'll have to tell you about that later. That was a huge mess. It turns out that that NGO was not a real NGO and they were false advertising. And it was like a whole mess. But I don't think a lot of people realize that fishing is so embedded in Indigenous culture, especially up here in Alaska, that you can't just stop.
Yeah. Yeah, and especially, yeah, and like I said, I don't want to speak too much on the topic, but especially when you live in a community where groceries are really expensive. Um, my community, we didn't harvest whales in my community, but seals were commonly harvested, and I think people don't realize that like milk where I grew up was $8 a gallon. Yeah.
Oh my God.
At times, it depends, but yeah, it's very expensive to live there. And I think like one thing that frustrates me is people like, you can buy anything at a supermarket. You can be vegan, you can do this. And I'm like, for some people, that's not a reality.
Mm-hmm.
Like where I grew up, produce was a lot of times rotten or it's not good quality when it gets there. So the access to fresh fruits and vegetables and like things that allow you to be vegan is just not there.
I have found that out the hard way, because California, you can pick an avocado in Mexico and have it on your tacos that night. And
Yeah.
so we were extremely lucky to have beautiful produce in our stores. And I come up here and I'm walking through Fred Meyer and I'm looking at the strawberries and I'm like, oh, I don't want them anymore.
Yeah.
And
And
I
it's
imagine it's even harder to get that up in smaller communities, because I'm in Juneau, which is
yeah.
one of the three bigger cities in Alaska. But
Yeah.
I think people watch this documentary and they're like, I know everything now. I'm an expert. And then
Yeah.
when experts try and tell them, like, hey, no, this isn't how this is, they're like, you're wrong. Watch Seaspiracy.
Yeah, exactly. And we kind of got off topic, but you were talking about like, oh, people don't realize that, like, for, let's say, the halibut industry, Alaska's implemented this IFQ, and there's IFQs not just in Alaska, they're in the US in general, for Pacific halibut. So Washington, Oregon, and California all have IFQs. But I think that people don't realize that in Alaska, we've worked really hard to address issues. And I was thinking about this last night, and, the best way to describe it is that it's not that there's not issues in Alaska in our fisheries. They're not as significant as like you're going to have in a, fishery in international waters where there's no regulation and no management. But we really try to find solutions to problems before it turns into a disaster.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and then, like I said, it's all unique to the fishery. So they do different things with salmon. And I was really frustrated in Seaspiracy because I can't remember exactly when this was in the documentary, but someone they were interviewing was saying, like, oh, they've told you that eating salmon is better than eating tuna. And that's not true. Salmon isn't sustainable either. And I was thinking, well, that's not true, because just simply from a biological perspective, it's a lot easier to, have salmon be sustainable than tuna. A big thing that is a benefit to salmon is that they return to the same river that they were born in.
Mm-hmm.
And so, like in Alaska, we have weirs where biologists will literally be sitting there counting fish. And then once a certain number of fish has returned and they've deemed like, okay, there's enough salmon that have returned this year to replenish the population, we can begin harvesting.
Mm-hmm.
Compare that to a tuna where we don't fully know where they spawn. We don't have a way of monitoring how many are in the population. We can't count them when they return to somewhere. Not only that, they live a lot longer than a salmon. And, how long a salmon lives depends on the species. We have 5 species here in Alaska and the Pacific Northwest. But with tuna, they live a lot longer. They grow a lot larger. It takes much longer for them to reach sexual maturity. And so how can you compare, just from a biological perspective, the two fish, because they're completely different? So I'd argue salmon's a lot more sustainable. I grew up salmon fishing, eat wild Alaskan salmon.
That's all I have heard people say. Like, there's stickers everywhere here. It's fresh.wild.alaskan or some like sticker like that. See it everywhere. But I think another problem that people seem to have with Seaspiracy is Seaspiracy had the perfect opportunity to talk about what's happening in Washington with the Chinook salmon, which is something I'm really passionate about. I got that book that you recommended, The King of Salmon.
Great.
So good. I think I'm like 2/3 of the way done, but I'm super passionate about that because marine mammals are my thing, and the Chinook salmon is directly impacting the southern residents. And Seaspiracy had the perfect opportunity to be like, this is a real issue that does not include the fishing industry. This is what's happening in our government right now. And this is something that you can do from your home to change this. But they just attacked the fishing industry. And I'm like, the fishing industry isn't all what is causing harm to our oceans.
Yeah. One thing that really bothered me is it almost seemed like they were trying to say like, oh, plastic, single-use plastic isn't a problem and global warming isn't the problem. And I'm sitting here going, growing up in Alaska, I'm seeing changes in my lifetime. And if you look at from a biological perspective, what climate change can do to species, there's going to be huge impacts. And then I also think that, we all need to do our part. And I certainly don't have any problem with people who choose not to eat seafood. That's their business. I think that people should be educated on the issue too, and know the difference between sustainable and non sustainable fishing practices. However, we all contribute to the problem. And I'm sure you've realized reading King of Fish, like, we've dammed rivers, specifically talking about salmon. We've dammed rivers, we've clear cut, we've put in roads. I sent you that article about
Yes.
the chemical in tires, which they're now linking to mass dying of salmon.
And
There's
we
so
even talked about this has more to do with fish in general, but birth control. When
yeah,
we ingest birth control and we urine it out, it goes to the ocean and it's causing problems in fish. And
yeah,
Seaspiracy talked a little bit about single-use plastic, like, oh, use your bamboo utensils and all this other stuff, which I think it was great. And I try to tell people, I'm like, it's gonna save you money in the
yeah,
long run because I fill this up from my tap water in my dorm and I don't have to buy plastic water bottles anymore. And a big thing, like reusable grocery bags in California, it's 10 cents per bag.
yeah,
So if you have 10 grocery bags, that's $1. And
yeah,
every dollar is worth something in my book.
yeah,
And with sandwich baggies, I talked about it in my video about Seaspiracy. I was using like 7 to 8 sandwich bags a day. And when you think about, okay, if you buy the reusable ones, you're going to save money over a long time because you don't have to keep buying it. And Seaspiracy kind of touched on it, but they didn't really go into detail. They're like, oh, this is a tiny problem. And then they went on their way. When I think unsustainable fishing, global warming, and plastic pollution all is a problem. And they just seemed to just dig and dig and dig at fishermen without. I totally understand sustainable options for like reusable plastics is not accessible to everyone,
hmm,
but they didn't really make it seem like, oh, if you have the opportunity to do this, like this is something that you should think about doing. They really liked firing at you fishermen.
yeah. And I think, it's important. Like, there are unregulated, poorly managed fisheries, and there's a lot of fish stocks globally that are not doing well. But making that distinction, and I sent you or I might have told you about that other documentary, The End of the Line.
Yes, I have it on my list to watch. I think it's on Hulu.
Yeah, it's a great documentary, and I really liked that documentary because it brought up a lot of the issues that Seaspiracy did. I don't know why Seaspiracy was acting as if they were like the first to uncover all of this, because I'm going like, this
First
is
off, I want to know if this was such a big problem that they felt like they needed to make a documentary out of it. Why was the producer and everything not a scientist? You
that's
had
what I wondered too.
every opportunity to bring in wildlife biologists, fish biologists. You could have even brought in commercial fishermen
Yeah.
to like bring in light to what is happening, but they were a very biased documentary and I don't know why they thought that this film guy who had no marine biology, no fishery experience or anything and thought that he could make a good documentary.
Yeah, I noticed like right off from the beginning, he's, talking about himself, and he's like, after college, I started making documentaries or something. I was like, he talks about he graduated. I'm like, okay, but what's your degree? And that's not to say that, you need a college degree to be sound in science. I know tons of commercial fishermen who have no college degree. We talked about this when we last had a video call. But they are really well versed in science and fisheries management. They're incredibly intelligent people. However, I think if you're going to act as if you're an expert and make this giant documentary and broadcast it on something like Netflix.
Be an expert.
An expert.
Really be one.
Yeah.
They brought in, first off, I don't know why they brought in the whole Taiji dolphin drive, because that's a whole problem within its own. That has its own documentary and its own problem. But from what I was understanding and from what I have researched, I'm 21, so the past like 10 years of my life has been dedicated to ocean animals. The Taiji dolphin drive is not going after tuna. They're not killing dolphins because they're hurting the tuna population, which I guess when you look at it that way, that favors them in the film, because they're like, oh, they're killing the tuna, so we're going to kill the dolphins. And they fit their agenda to put that in. Japan has some things in their dolphin drive that could be classified as cultural, but it's nowhere near as sustainable as the indigenous up here in Alaska and Canada. But I just don't understand why they brought that in. Like, they threw that in there and I was like, I thought we were talking about fish. That's not, that's a mammal.
Yeah. And I think, you know, I don't know anything about that. I'm not familiar. I mean, I've heard of it, but I'm not an expert. But
so you're not going to make a documentary on it?
That's what my next project will be after college. But I think like another thing, a big misconception I see is that like commercial fishermen, we just hate marine mammals and we want to kill them and we just want to destroy the ecosystem. And it's like, no, we get excited when we see whales. Like,
you were telling me, you were sending all these amazing videos that you have seen on your summers fishing, and I was like, I'm working on the wrong dang boat because I haven't even seen stuff like that.
Yeah. And I mean, there are issues. Big problems in Alaska right now involve marine mammals depredating, which means they take fish off of our lines.
It's a problem in California too.
Yeah. And it's both on the commercial side and the sports side. And I kind of see this like switching narrative, and I kind of wanted to bring this up with you. Like, on one hand, people are like, oh, you know, killer whales and dolphins and whales are so intelligent, they're so smart. But then when us fishermen are like, hey, there's this issue with depredation, they're stealing, you know, fish from us. And I know people are gonna be like, well, that was their fish to eat first. That's a whole other topic, but I've been to presentations where there's kind of proof that certain species of, you know, whales, like sperm whales, weren't always eating the species they're eating now that they're depredating off of commercial fishing gear. That's a whole other topic.
I'll have to look into that more because I'm not familiar with sperm whales, or you'll have to point me in the direction to where I can read more on that.
Yeah, I definitely will. But then if we bring up issues, we're attacked, and we're like, we're not trying to hurt the whales. We're not asking to kill the whales. We just want to minimize interactions.
See, and I think a lot of the problem, so are these interactions that people are telling you, oh, well, you just want to kill the whale? Is it like the fishermen and scientists, or is it fishermen and the people who think they're scientists?
I think a lot of times it's the people who think they're scientists, but it kind of depends on who you're talking to, essentially. Like, I know there are biologists that certainly have a negative view of commercial fishermen. And I know a lot of commercial fishermen feel like, you know, we're kind of viewed as like these dumb people who are like really simple in our thinking, and all we want to do is kill things. And it's like, that's not true. Yeah. And so like on the one hand, people are saying like, oh, these whales are so smart. But then they're also like, no, the whales aren't smart enough to follow a vessel. And I'm like, no, they definitely are. And I've watched it happen, particularly out in the Aleutians when we're halibut fishing. I've seen pods of like 20 whales, and they'll follow us for days.
Animals are far smarter than we ever give them credit for. Maybe not on a fish level, but with mammals such as bears and whales, like, they are so incredibly smart. I wouldn't say necessarily like humpback whales are smart, but like killer whales, it's been proven killer whales just have an enormous amount of knowledge in their brain. I think, I don't know how recent, it wasn't recent, but probably back in like 2012, between 2012 and 2015, they were attempting to teach a killer whale down in SeaWorld San Diego to count. And there was like progression that was happening. I don't know if they kept going with it. And then now that SeaWorld is a huge controversy, they stopped. But there was like a project going on where they were attempting to, because they saw that it was able to learn.
Yeah.
Something like that. And I mean, we can train these animals. Look at bears in the circus and whales in marine parks. Like, they are trainable. They are now on the level that we put dogs on, and now probably are above that at this point.
Yeah. And so I think, like, as fishermen and, for fisheries, because not all fisheries have, interactions with, let's say, killer whales. And then even within fisheries that do have interactions with killer whales, it's different for, like, let's say what I do, long lining, and then trawling, which is the fishery that was involved in that picture that we were talking about. But I heard something, I don't know if this is true, but there was like a documented case of where some diver was like at SeaWorld and he got into a tank to like clean it, and he heard a beluga, like he heard something and it sounded like get out. And it turned out it was a beluga that had like learned to mimic human speech, and it was saying get out, which is like really creepy to me. Like if I was diving in the water and I heard,
like, okay, I'm getting out right now.
yeah. Yeah.
I will say I'm not as educated on belugas as I am killer whales, but beluga whales are known as the canaries of the sea because they have such a wide vocal structure. I did not hear about that. It could be true. It could not be true. And it could be just the media like, look, this whale can talk.
Yeah.
But I wouldn't be surprised if beluga whales were able to kind of mimic sounds, because seeing it at SeaWorld, I've done a couple behind the scenes things when I supported SeaWorld. They'll do certain sounds, like they'll touch their melon in a certain area and they'll make certain sounds. So they are intelligent enough to know, okay, I'm being touched right here. Let's make this sound. Okay, they're touching right here. Okay, we're going to sound like this. So I wouldn't put it totally on the false narrative side, but part of me is like, there has to be something about that is a little bit twisted.
Yeah.
But
yeah, and I guess I just bringing that up to point out, like, whales are very intelligent. So I think, and I think as our climate continues to change, we're going to have to adjust, and we're going to have to change the way we interact with all life on this planet. Things aren't going to remain the same.
And I know down at home, like I said, we have mountain lions, we have coyotes, and with California, if we had this mountain range in California, well, we do, it's called Big Bear. There's huge cities and mountain ranges. And even in my backyard, like my mom and I go hiking, and I live 20 minutes from Disneyland. Not woodsy whatsoever. And there's signs on the trail that says there are mountain lions here and you need to be cautious. And there's been so many times where there's mountain lions in our yards and they get euthanized and are put, that's what euthanized means, put down.
Yeah.
And they'll just be discarded. And 20 years ago, that wasn't a problem because we didn't build onto their resources and onto their land. And in 20 years, it's only going to be worse. And even up here in Alaska, I've seen a couple projects being built. In 20 years, there's going to be even more projects being built because more people are going to want to live here and more people are going to have families up here. And I think a lot of people are stuck 20 years ago when interacting with animals wasn't a big deal, when in reality there are bears in the university's trash room once a year. Like,
Yeah.
We can't have the same mindset we had 20 years ago. We have to think now 20 years into the future. We can't even have the same mindset now because these animals are so far advanced from us.
Well, and I think that's a really important thing to bring up. Specifically with seaspiracy, I was like, we're getting a lot of hate as commercial fishermen, but the reality is that each human has an impact. If you're going to look at issues surrounding human, specifically like whale interactions, shipping, you know,
Yeah.
global
Amazon.
shipping is a huge industry. I don't think a lot of people realize this, but there's major shipping lanes in Alaska, particularly going through some of the passes and the Aleutians.
Mhm.
There are ships that are gigantic. Like, I feel like we have a big boat. I work on a boat that's 65 feet
Mhm.
long. These boats are like thousands of feet long. They're massive, and the amount of stuff that you'll see in containers, like they have stacks and stacks of containers, and it's all things that we're purchasing and shipping into the United States. And I mean, you can't just get rid of that, but we also have to recognize that. We have to recognize that as our climates change, species are going to start shifting their ranges. And we also have to recognize it's not like our global population is shrinking. We are rapidly growing.
And it's the same with the cruise line industry. There are so many stories out there that a cruise ship came into port and they have a dead whale on the bow of their boat. And people, I don't want to say this to make people think, oh my God, I have to stop every single thing that I do. And I
Yeah.
just have to live as a hobbit in a hole. Because, like I said, that's not possible.
Yeah.
But we're so concerned with fishermen and what fishermen are doing, but take a step back because there have been so many people on my boat that I have seen just like throw trash while because I work on a Zodiac, so we're going like 35 miles an hour on the ocean, and they'll just like toss their trash, and I'm like, I'm gonna take a guess and say you have said before in your life, save our oceans or something along those lines. And I think as a human race, we are just very hypocritical. You can't begrudge fishermen for doing their job when someone who works on a cruise line might be like, oh my God, fishermen are horrible, but your industry is also doing harm as well. And I don't know why fishermen are taking all the heat.
Yeah. And there's certainly, like I said, there's poorly managed fisheries out there. And we have to accept that globally we need food to feed our growing population. I am not saying go out and catch all the fish. I think the best thing we can do is follow Alaska's lead, start using science-based management, manage fisheries based on the species, based on the gear type, work with managers, biologists, and fishermen to come up with solutions, find problems, and fix them before they become disasters.
I totally agree with you. And speaking on Alaska's fisheries, I would say for the most part, they seem to have a good grasp about what it means to be sustainable in fishing. So we know Alaska is unique in that aspect. And so when you say take Alaska's lead and some science-based information and science-based lead for sustainable fishing, what else does Alaska do to ensure their sustainability and to limit their bycatch? Because you don't hear a lot of bycatch up in Alaska.
Yeah, so again, I feel like I'm like a broken record here. Depends on the fishery. We, you know, I think the best thing, we really try hard to do accurate stock assessments. That looks different for each species. A lot of fisheries have observer coverage, and I know they talked about observers in seaspiracy. That was a whole other topic that got me irritated because international observer programs have been known to be problematic. I actually was really interested in becoming an observer. I've decided not to do it just for personal reasons, but I really did look into it. I've met with observers in Alaska. I've worked with them. because they're on our boats.
Mhm.
Um, and they all told me, like, do not get on an international boat. But I felt like they, again, didn't really complete the narrative. So, like in Alaska, we have, depending on the fishery, some fisheries have 100% observer coverage. And I think they made it sound like the observers are enforcement or they're like fish cops. They're not. All they are is they're reporters. They simply report data. So Alaska has observers in many fisheries. It depends on what you're targeting and where you're fishing. Um, we we work really hard to make sure that our reporting is accurate. I don't think a lot of people realize that, and not in all fisheries. Again, it's fishery dependent. We actually have GPS trackers.
Yeah, you
So
mentioned this when I sent the killer whale photo to you.
yeah, so like for instance, my boat in certain areas we have to have this. It's a particular type of essentially GPS on our boat, and when we report, oh, we caught this fish in this area, they can go and look and make sure that we were actually fishing in that area. And if you're caught fishing in an area that you like said you weren't, there's a lot of problems. You're going to get in big trouble. Um, and we're constantly trying to evolve our fisheries management. There's a lot of talk, and I think it's actually being implemented in using genetics
Mhm.
to make stock assessments more accurate. In terms of bycatch, I feel like I keep saying it, it's fishery dependent. Um, I think that, we work hard. We also work hard to just have fishermen input and local input. Fisheries management, if you have an issue within the state of Alaska, you can directly bring it up to management, and anyone can do it. It's open to the public. There's certain times where you can do this, and they're willing to listen to you and take you seriously, which I think is really important. I think that, not to say that the public is what we should completely follow, but the public is going to be, particularly fishermen, are going to be the ones seeing issues.
Yeah.
um and so and enforcement is really, really common in Alaska. I don't think a lot of people realize that there's several agencies that can board commercial fishing vessels at any time. They have complete legal rights to do so, including the Coast Guard. So, we could all be sleeping at night after a day of fishing, and they could call us on the radio and say, we're conducting a boarding. And we all have to make sure we have our crew members' licenses out. The captain has to get out his logbooks and show the data. He has to talk with the officer, whoever is in charge when we board, and they can go through our possessions, and they can go through the fish hold, and they can go through our gear. So it's very minimal that the chance of illegal fishing. It's also something we don't want to do.
Yeah, and I think that goes along with just how much respect Alaska has for their oceans and for their land. Because I've talked to a couple people in California at home, and they're like, it's just fish. Like, why do you care? And I think that would be great if other states like Washington and Oregon, California could follow in that lead. Do you think that in the future we could see other states following in their lead, or do you think they're going to be like, that's too much work, like we don't want to do that?
So I 100% think that other states can follow Alaska's lead. We're already seeing that happen. A lot of states have reformed their fisheries and they're following Alaska's management practices. And actually, globally, that's happening too, which is really great to see. And we've seen really great results coming from fisheries reforming and following Alaska's management practices. And I wanted to add in, I know I've referenced, like I said, it's a broken record. I keep saying, oh, it's fisheries dependent, but you can, like, anyone can look up different fisheries in Alaska. You can find out how they're managed, and you can look up stock assessments, bycatch data. It's all available on NOAA
Mhm.
or the Alaska Department of Fish and Game.
Okay, I don't think that's something that a lot of people no, because I think the people who are watching these types of documentaries aren't interested in doing the real research. Like, I'll sit for hours and read through scientific papers and buy books and read them. But the audience that these are targeting are not the audience that is going to go do more research. And it's the same with every documentary. Like, one that upset me, like Seaspiracy upsets you, is Blackfish. And I know that's kind of weird because I don't agree with cetacean captivity. So people were like, well, why would Blackfish upset you then? Because they're like against captivity. A lot of the time, the people who watch it and they're like, oh, you still, because I still support SeaWorld's like research and rescue, because they rescue thousands of animals over their lifetime of being open. And it's like with fishing, like there are sustainable fishing, and then the people who watch Blackfish or Seaspiracy, they're like, no, that's not what this documentary said. You're lying.
Yeah.
And there needs to be a documentary that is specifically science-based, because was there any like scientist with a degree in Seaspiracy? I know Rico Berry and I forgot her name, but she leads the whale sanctuary project. They were in there to talk about the Taiji drive, but other than that, I do not think there were the people from the organizations, but there was no wildlife biologist. There was nothing to really represent the good side of fishing.
Yeah, so they actually interviewed, I recommended that book to you, The Unnatural History of the Sea.
Mm-hmm.
And Callum Roberts, who wrote that book, was actually really heavily featured in Seaspiracy. He is a big proponent of marine protected areas.
Mm-hmm.
That book is, I recommend the ocean, because we kind of think that we're having an impact now, and we're not. But I kind of felt like, and maybe his viewpoints have changed, but I kind of felt like, from what I've read in the papers I've read, because he's he's, I think, a marine ecologist, but he does a lot of work in fisheries. And from the papers I've read, he's not like, you can't eat seafood at all. He just really is strongly for marine protected areas and sustainable fishing. And I read an interview because I was like, am I confusing him with another really famous like global fisheries person?
Yeah.
And I found an interview where he was talking with a journalist. Oh, what was that?
I was gonna say that doesn't seem like something that Seaspiracy would want in their film then, if he's like not against what they're against.
Yeah, and I looked up, I think it might have cut out, but I looked up his viewpoints just because I was like, am I confusing him with someone else? And I found an interview between him and a journalist from the New York Times where he's like, I eat seafood. And he like talked about his opinions on it. And I was like, this just seems kind of different from what they portrayed in Seaspiracy. Although I do know that from what I've read, he was a supporter of the documentary.
I have had, go ahead.
Oh, I think he's more concerned with, which I am too, international fishing and poor fisheries practices.
I've read a couple different papers from people, and I follow a bunch of people that were like super invested in the whole debunking of the Seaspiracy film. And they've found out, they did an interview on this app called Clubhouse. I'm not familiar with it. It's not my forte. I don't know anything about it, but it's an app where you can like conduct interviews, like either like video or audio, whatever. And they interviewed a girl from I don't know the name, but she was in Seaspiracy. And it was right before the woman who told them, like, shut the camera off, like, I don't want to do this anymore. And she was saying that a lot of what she was said in the original interview was left out. And they like twisted her words. And I think that's how a lot of things happened because she saw the film and she was like, that's not what I said at all. And you twisted it and you edited it to make it seem like I was saying something that I wasn't. And it just comes with being a biased documentary. I genuinely think they did a lot of that because them as producers and directors didn't have a lot of knowledge on the fishery industry. And when they started learning about what actually happens, they're like, I can't fricking put this in my against fisheries documentary because you just said something good about the fishing industry.
Yeah, and you know, for a lot of us in Alaska or in the United States in general, we're like, it just seems so convenient you left us out. Like all you have is Alaska and talk to a, you know, man or a biologist here and they would give you some information. All you had to do even before that was Google.
Yeah.
Like you could go to NOAA Fisheries or the Alaska Department of Fish and Game, and it's right there, all that information. And I know people probably think that like, oh, Alaska's fisheries are only sustainable because they're certified sustainable, blah, blah, blah. And yes, a lot of Alaska fisheries, I think most are certified sustainable by various groups, Seafood Watch, things like that. But we're also certified internally with our own management and, you know, resource use practices.
Mm-hmm.
Sustainability isn't something that we're just like looking to get certified by, you know, MSC.
Mm-hmm.
Where we want to make sure that our resources are sustainable and can be used for generations to come. And so I think that a big thing that I've felt is that, you know, the message of Seaspiracy was just don't eat seafood at all. And you can't trust any seafood because the labeling practices is like are not correct and they're biased. And I'm sure a lot of that's true.
There's
But
problems.
yeah, there's definitely problems. But what I'd recommend is that for anyone who wants, like, who watched that documentary and is now food I would mind sustainable, I'd say start with the United States and start with Alaska. Like if you love halibut or you love salmon, start with a fishery for, you know, that type of fish in the United States, particularly in Alaska, and then look up how they're rated by like Seafood Watch.
Yeah,
It's not
that's the app from Monterey Bay, I think.
Yeah, and it's not 100% like that shouldn't be your only source of information.
Mm-hmm.
From there, if it says it's sustainable, look up information on NOAA and look up information on ADF&G. All the records are available to the public, and then make your own decisions. Do your own research. I think that's the biggest thing I can recommend for people.
Yeah, and that was actually going to be one of the last questions and last topics that I brought up is how can you pick sustainable seafood? Because I don't really like seafood. I will eat like bass occasionally if my boyfriend or my grandpa go out fishing, but I don't eat seafood partially just because I don't like it, and partially just it was super easy to cut out of my diet since I didn't eat it that often. So I just chose to not eat it anymore. But like when I go grocery shopping, if my boyfriend wants me to pick up salmon, I'm like, I have no clue what, because I don't eat fish. So I was like, I don't know what is like to look for in sustainability for salmon or anything. And you mentioned Seafood Watch, which I have talked about a little bit on my channel when I brought up sustainable fishing. But besides that, like what is, and looking into NOAA, is there certain things if you're looking for tuna at the store, is there something that you should look for on like a can or anything that would point to it being sustainable?
I definitely say, although it's not 100%, like I said, it's not like there isn't issues in fisheries in the United States, but seeing product of the USA or like caught in the USA
Mm-hmm.
um, is certainly a really great starting point. I, you know, I'm mostly familiar with like salmon, halibut, things like that. So like if you see Alaskan, um, that's a good indicator that it's likely sourced from Alaska. There is misidentification,
Mm-hmm.
but from what I understand, Alaska has pretty strict laws on what seafood can be labeled what.
Okay.
I don't have a picture like personally, there's tons of information online. Like you can look up images of like wild caught salmon versus farmed salmon.
Mhm.
Farmed salmon is a whole other topic. Talk about, I guess, in some other videos sometime. Um, but that's a great place if you want to support sustainable wild fisheries. Know the differences in what the fish looks like actually on the market. It's harder with other species, but salmon's really easy to identify. Like I can look at salmon and be like, that's wild fish or that's farmed fish. Um, there's a lot we can do. I think another thing that's really important is ask your local, grocery store or your local restaurants to carry Alaskan seafood, wild caught seafood. And now I think especially with social media being kind of a very popular thing these days, a lot of fishermen, a lot of Alaskan fishermen are actually directly marketing their fish. So you can buy it directly from the fisherman and they can tell you where it was caught, when it was caught,
That's
how it's
awesome.
processed. Yeah, it's really great. And a lot of them offer shipping directly to your door. So,
So great. That is such a great step because a lot of people want convenience. So if they don't have to go to the grocery store to even buy the fish, that because like DoorDash is so common, Instacart is so common. If they see that, and because I don't think a lot of people know, like I can buy salmon and have it shipped right to my door, and
yeah,
it's good salmon because we all know wild caught salmon doesn't even compare. No, the
yeah.
other way. Farmed salmon doesn't even compare to wild caught salmon.
Yeah. And I think another thing is that when you buy wild sustainable seafood, you're supporting the industry. And so we can continue to make progress and make the necessary changes that we need to make. So you're supporting, science-based management.
That's awesome. You have brought up so many great points. I wanted to let my viewers know that if they have any further questions, they are feel free to comment them. I will forward them to Molly, and then I will literally copy and paste her response. Did you have any last things that maybe you have thought about throughout our conversation or that we didn't touch on that you wanted to bring up?
Yeah, I think the biggest thing is I think that a lot of times it's portrayed that like all commercial fishermen we kind of avoid the question or we avoid the topic, and it might have seemed like I was doing that today. But commercial fishing is really varies, and there's a um, differences in between fisheries and the species you're capturing and the gear you're using. And so I think that the best thing we could do is do your research, like I said, but also be open to listening to, our voices, the people that are, making their livelihood off the ocean. We really do care, and we want to see sustainable seafood being harvested for generations to come.
Awesome. That if you can go ahead and I'll maybe look through our text messages and find them. But if you have any articles or anything that you want me to put links to in the description, send them over to me. And then my viewers, you can go ahead and check out the description. I'm gonna link some books that she's recommended to me and some of the articles that she has sent me. She is so knowledgeable. And like I said, she goes to my school. I'm so glad we got the opportunity to talk because it originally started as an idea. And I was like, oh, well, maybe I can find someone who is interested in doing this. And I was thinking of a couple students. And then we sparked up a conversation, I think in DMs or something like that. And I was like, this is the one. She is the one
Yeah.
I want to talk to.
Yeah, and I really appreciate you, letting me speak, and from the perspective of a commercial fisherman and a fisheries biologist. I feel like a lot of times our voices aren't heard, and I think the best thing we can do is all work together to solve issues.
And just bring awareness because people don't see the side of commercial fishermen. They're going to watch the documentary and they're going to be like, I hate all fishermen are horrible. But I hope that at least one person watches this video and they're like, oh, maybe I should do more research. Like maybe commercial fishermen are not the devils on earth.
Yeah, that's my hope too.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Molly, for coming on here. I really, really appreciate it. And to everyone who is watching, if you stuck around to hear us talk this entire time, I give you major props. We got off topic a couple times, but everything in marine biology and fisheries all eventually tie back into each other. So, like I said, thank you everyone for watching. Please check the description box for a bunch of resources, and I will see you in my next video. Maybe I will have Molly on here again, because there are definitely so many things that we could talk about.
Yeah, I'd love to.
All right, bye guys.
Thank you.